Welcome to part 4 of the Great War. Now we're going to take a look at the Battle of Messines. So here in Europe on the Western Front, because both sides had ended up getting marred in trench warfare, and you have this completely stagnant front line for years on end, you're going to see advancements made in technology as both sides desperately try and find some way to make this battlefield mobile again. Now, some of it is going to be just taking technology that already exists and taking it to the next level. Like, for example, submarines. Submarines were not invented during World War I. Matter of fact, the first attempt to use a submarine in warfare actually took place during the American Revolution, when a group of colonists created a submarine with the idea that it would be able to sail underwater and sail up to British ships and attach explosives to it and detonate it and sink the ship. Now, it actually worked except for that last little piece, the attaching explosives part didn't work out. So submarines are there, but the Germans are going to take submarines to a whole new level. You see, the Royal Navy is going to control the high seas. There's only going to be one major surface battle in the war. It's called the Battle of Jutland, right? The German Navy is pretty much going to be stuck in their port there at Kiel for the entirety of the war. But both sides are going to try and starve each other out. The way the Royal Navy is going to do it is by blockading and preventing any supplies getting to Germany by controlling the surface of the sea. And the Germans are going to try and do it by blockading the British Isles by using these wolf packs of submarines to attack cargo ships from under the sea, right? So you have the advancement in submarine warfare. Flamethrowers. Again, flamethrowers existed, but you're sitting there in a trench and you're so close to the enemy's trench that you actually can hear their conversations. You can actually have conversations across the trenches. So you think to yourself, wouldn't it be pretty cool if I could take flame and throw it over and into that trench? Well, you get advancements in flamethrower technology that will allow you to attempt to do that, right? Zeppelins. Again, the Zeppelins had already existed, but now they're going to be repurposed for combat. Your first bombings of London are not going to take place in World War II. They're going to take place in World War I, and they're going to be done by Zeppelins, airships. You imagine you're in London, and all of a sudden this big German Zeppelin shows up overhead and starts dropping bombs on you. Of course, aircraft. Aircraft are relatively new, and for the most part, people don't know what to do with them. They can see them as a useful weapon of war, but how? Doing what, right? And this is a question that actually is going to still perplex strategists into World War II, right? How do you use bombers, for example? Do you do strategic bombing or do you do close air support? That's a lot of stuff that's still going to be sorted out. Now, initially, aircraft, it was very obvious that its most useful purpose was reconnaissance, right? You fly over their lines, you can record where all their trenches are, and these trenches now have several layers, right? Where all the back trenches are, right? And the other side is doing the same. Then finally, one guy one day goes, you know what? I've been passing Franz in the air every day. We kind of wave at each other. He's photographing my lines. I'm photographing his lines. Bring my pistol tomorrow. I'm going to take a pop shot at him. And you can see how that'll just advance from there. Next thing you know, you're mounting machine guns on there. You're inventing a timing cam so you don't shoot your own propeller off. I'm hoping that got discovered on the ground, not in the air, right? And these planes are now fighting each other in these in the sky in these dog fights, right? A term that's still used today, even though these planes, when they're fighting in the air and the machine guns and the carbureted engines choking out, kind of sound like dogs barking. I'm sure an F-15 Eagle doesn't sound like a dog barking when it's in combat, right? You have the invention of the modern hand grenade. Again, grenades and things like grenades have existed for a long time. But the idea of, like, for example, the Germans are going to invent a grenade that is a grenade on the end of a stick. You pull that, you start it, and you throw the stick, and the dog fetches it and brings it back, and you die, right? And the, okay, just kidding on the last part, right? And the British are going to create what they call mill bombs, right? But they're most often referred to as pineapple grenades. And again, the whole thing, the trenches are close together. What if I can throw a grenade into that trench? Pineapple grenades were called that because of what they look like. They kind of look like pineapples. And that shape was actually designed for better grip, but also for proper fragmentation, right? Modern machine guns, right? The mechanisms of the modern machine gun developed before World War I and perfected during the war is very similar to the mechanisms that are in place in machine guns still today. That's how good of a design it is that comes up during this time. A machine gun is a force multiplier. Instead of a rifleman who can fire, say he's really good with a repeating rifle and he can fire, say, 6 shots, 10 shots, 12 shots a minute. Now you got a machine gun that can literally send hundreds of rounds downfield a minute. That's an extreme increase in killing power, right? Tanks, all an effort to try and get the battlefield mobile again. People are going over the top into this no man's land, getting riddled with machine gun fire, getting these kill zones. Well, what if we can put them in a metal box that we can drive, that the machine guns can't hit? And so the British actually developed this design for the Mark I tank, and it's designed to be able to cross over the top of trenches and cross no man's land. It's impervious to machine gun fire. However, it is so slow that you can actually target it with artillery and hit it, right? And men will march behind it, but it's all in this effort to try and make things more mobile on the battlefield. Now, the British will call it the land ship, but it's code name because when they brought it over, super secret project, they had it covered with these tarps, and people would ask, what's under the tarp? You just say, oh, they're water tanks. Don't worry about it. That word tank stuck. Thank God it did. Can you imagine calling the M1 Abrams the M1 Abrams land ship? Pretty horrible name. All right. And finally, you got weapons of mass destruction, poison gas, right? It'll start on the Western Front with the French. They are going to use xylate bromide as a gas. It's a tear gas, right? They're going to use them in grenades and then eventually artillery shells. The Germans will start using the same, and then they'll invent another type of gas. They'll start using chlorine gas, and then they'll invent a gas called phosphine. And you see this goes back and forth, and ultimately end up with some really nasty stuff like mustard gas, which is a blistering agent. It burns the skin, it saturates the clothes. You'll be actually out there after an attack, and it's gotten in your clothes, and you're warming yourself in the fire, and mustard gas will start outgassing off of your clothes. Pretty horrifying stuff. But honestly, poison gas was really just a terror weapon, and actually of the fatalities in World War I, less than 5% of them were caused by gas. Okay, now I'm not going to go through every battle of the war because it would take too long, but I do want to go through one to just give you the feel for how little these lines on the Western Front moved. So I'm going to go over the Battle of Messines because I find it probably the most interesting. Now, the Battle of Messines is kind of a precursor to the massive attacks that will take place in the Third Battle of the Ypres, right, in 1917. Okay, but the planning for the Battle of Messines will actually begin in January of 1916. It's going to be 18 months of planning for an attack that's going to take place on June 7th, 1917, right? 18 months. That's how little the battle lines will move during this time. The plan here was to dig a series of mine shafts underneath the German lines, underneath their trenches, okay? So they're going to begin an 18-month project and dig 22 mine shafts under the enemy lines. Now, the Germans are going to know that they're doing this, right? And they're actually going to be digging counter mine shafts. As a matter of fact, two of them will actually even find each other. So you have fighting underground, right? This is an interesting war in that you have fighting above ground, underground, on the sea, under the sea, in the air. I mean, every place but space, okay? So you have 21 mine shafts that will be completed. Now, what do you do after you complete these mine shafts? Pop up with a bunch of men and attack in the trenches? No. You pack them full of explosives. You pack them chock full of explosives. And the idea then is on the day of the battle, when all the German soldiers are in those front trenches, you blow the mine shafts up and you wipe them out. Okay. So, on May 21st, 1917, 2,300 British artillery guns and 300 heavy mortars will open up a bombardment of the German lines at Messines. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, for quite literally 2+ weeks. Right? Remember, the battle takes place on June 7th. The artillery barrage begins on May 21st. Literally millions of tons of ordnance fired. Okay. The shelling continues non-stop. Now, remember I mentioned there's a lot of different lines of trenches here. The men in the forward trenches, what they do when these artillery bombardments begin, they move to the back trenches where it's safe, and you keep a skeleton crew in the front trenches just to keep an eye on things, right? So you minimize your casualties that way during these artillery bombardments. But the British know this, and they're counting on this. Because what happens is when the artillery bombardment stops, that's when the enemy's going to come over the top and attack. So when the artillery stops, you rush all your men to those front trenches, as many as you can get in there. So at 2:50 in the morning on June 7th, the artillery barrage ends. General Herbert Plummer, who was leading the British operation, said, "Gentlemen, we may not make history tomorrow, but we will certainly change the geography." They ain't lying. As planned, the artillery barrage stops, and the Germans begin just pushing as many forces into those front trenches as they can. Right as the first edge of light starts to show on the horizons, the British don't go over the top immediately, right? They're waiting, they're giving time for these guys to get in the trenches. As the first hints of light begin to show up on the horizon, they blow the mines, right? 19 of the 21 mines were detonated. 2 of them were deemed that they just weren't in a good location, so they didn't set them off. 19 mines were exploded, and at Messines, the ridge was completely obliterated. 10,000 Germans were killed instantaneously in the blast. Okay, 9 British divisions will follow the explosion, following a creeping barrage moving towards the German lines. That's where your own artillery are firing their artillery shells just barely in front of your forces, and they slowly extend their range as you slowly march forward, and so you have this cover of artillery fire in front of you. Occasionally one of their shots falls short, and you do get killed by it, right? Okay. All this planning, 18 months, an explosion that killed 10,000 men immediately, 9 divisions and a creeping barrage. When everything was said and done, in the Battle of Messines, they had gained 2 miles of land. That's it. Just 2 miles of land, right? That's how little these lines moved. You can measure the ground gained by the hundreds of dead per foot, right? Now, interesting side note, the 2 mines they didn't blow up. Needless to say, the concussion from the explosion caused those mine shafts to collapse, and they lost track of where those mines were. One of them was found in 1955. On June 17th, 1955, during an electrical storm, lightning set off one of those 2 remaining mines. Big explosion in the field, and the landowner in that region there, it killed his cow. So apparently that cow found the worst place to stand. So that mine shaft was found in 1955. Think about that. That's almost 40 years later. The other mine that went unexploded, still out there somewhere. It's never been found. Hopefully the explosives in it have degraded after 100 years, that they're no longer volatile. But, who knows?